My son pointed at a Billionaire Alpha in a magazine, then called him Daddy. Welcome, everyone. Before we begin today's emotional story, we have one small request. If you enjoy heartfelt BL stories filled with unforgettable characters, powerful emotions, and meaningful journeys, please subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a future upload. It only takes a second, it is completely free, and your support helps us continue bringing you more stories that inspire, move, and entertain. We are truly grateful to have you here with us. Before the story begins, let us know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. We always enjoy seeing how far our stories travel and meeting viewers from across the globe. Now let us begin today's story. Children sometimes recognize the truth long before adults have the courage to face it. My name is Lucas Hayes, and if someone had told me that a single sentence from my 5-year-old son would completely change our lives, I would have smiled politely and said they had been watching too many movies. My son, Oliver, was bright, curious, and endlessly imaginative. He could spend hours inventing adventures for toy dinosaurs, convincing himself that clouds looked like sailing ships, and asking questions that somehow managed to leave every adult speechless. We lived in a quiet town where life moved at a comfortable pace. I worked as an art teacher at the local community center, and although we never had much money, our small apartment was always filled with laughter, books, and colorful drawings taped across every wall. Oliver had grown up surrounded by love, even if our little family looked different from everyone else's. Whenever classmates asked where his father was, he simply shrugged and said, "It is just me and Daddy." I had always admired how naturally he accepted our life. I never wanted him to feel that something was missing. Years ago, before Oliver was born, I had crossed paths with someone whose life could not have been more different from mine. Blackwood was already becoming one of the youngest billionaire entrepreneurs in the country, admired not only for his business success, but also for his quiet generosity. His foundation funded hospitals, schools, libraries, and scholarship programs across the nation, yet he rarely appeared in interviews unless the conversation focused on helping others. Our paths had crossed only briefly during a charity event where I had volunteered as a freelance artist. It had been one ordinary evening among thousands of ordinary evenings. Life moved forward, and I never expected our stories to intersect again. I certainly never imagined that years later his face would appear everywhere, from magazine covers to television interviews, becoming instantly recognizable to millions of people who had never met him. One rainy Saturday morning, Oliver and I stopped at a neighborhood medical clinic for his routine checkup. The waiting room was quiet except for the soft hum of the television mounted in one corner and the gentle sound of pages turning as people flipped through old magazines. Oliver wandered toward a small table stacked with reading material while I completed paperwork at the reception desk. A few moments later, I heard his cheerful voice echo across the room. "Daddy, look." I glanced up absent-mindedly, expecting him to show me another picture of dinosaurs or race cars. Instead, he stood perfectly still, holding an expensive business magazine with both hands. On its cover was a photograph of Blackwood standing in front of the newly completed children's research hospital funded by his foundation. Before I could say a single word, Oliver smiled with absolute certainty, pointed directly at the photograph, and said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "That is my daddy." The room became strangely quiet. A woman lowered the magazine she had been reading. An elderly gentleman looked up from his crossword puzzle. Even the receptionist paused in the middle of typing. My heart seemed to stop for one impossible moment. I walked quickly toward Oliver, forcing a calm smile that I did not feel. "Sweetheart," I whispered gently, "why would you say that?" Oliver looked up at me with innocent confidence, then back at the photograph. He hugged the magazine against his chest as though protecting something precious before giving the only answer he believed was necessary. "Because I know him." My son's answer followed me long after we left the clinic. I buckled Oliver into his car seat, started the engine, and drove home through a steady afternoon rain, but my thoughts never left that waiting room. Children imagined impossible things every day. They pretended cardboard boxes were castles and that stuffed animals held secret conversations after bedtime. Yet something about the way Oliver had looked at Blackwood's photograph had been different. There had been no hesitation, no excitement, no childish fantasy. He had spoken with the calm certainty of someone recognizing a familiar face. As soon as we reached home, I prepared grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup while Oliver colored pictures at the kitchen table. Every few minutes I caught him quietly sketching the same tall man, wearing a dark suit beside a smiling little boy. Finally, I sat across from him and asked as gently as I could, "Oliver, can you tell me why you called the man in the magazine your daddy?" He looked up from his drawing with complete innocence. "Because every time I dream about the nice man, he smiles exactly like that." My hands froze around my coffee mug. "You dream about him?" He nodded enthusiastically. "Sometimes we walk in a big garden. Sometimes he reads me stories. He always tells me that I should be kind to people who feel lonely." I stared at him without knowing how to respond. I had never shown Oliver photographs of Damien. I had never spoken his name inside our home. As far as I knew, my son should not have recognized him at all. That evening, after Oliver had fallen asleep, I opened the small wooden box I had not touched in years. Inside were old photographs, volunteer badges, and a folded invitation from the charity gala where I had first met Damien. It had been 6 years earlier. I was a struggling freelance illustrator helping decorate the event for children receiving educational scholarships. Damien had arrived without cameras or fanfare, spending more time talking with families than posing for photographs. We spoke only a handful of times throughout the evening, mostly about art, education, and the importance of giving children opportunities to dream. What surprised me most was how ordinary he seemed despite the extraordinary life everyone believed he lived. He listened more than he spoke. He remembered people's names. Before leaving, he thanked every volunteer individually. Our final conversation had lasted only a few quiet minutes beneath the lights decorating the garden courtyard. We promised that if our paths ever crossed again, we would spend more time discussing the community art programs we both believed every child deserved. Life, however, had other plans. Unexpected circumstances soon separated us, and I never reached out again. Looking back, I convinced myself that our brief connection had belonged to a single chapter already finished. I carefully returned the invitation to the box and closed the lid. There was no reason to reopen the past now. Damien Blackwood belonged to newspaper headlines, international conferences, and charitable foundations. I belonged to a quiet town where my greatest accomplishment was helping children discover confidence through painting. Our worlds no longer touched. The following afternoon, while picking Oliver up from preschool, his teacher smiled warmly and handed me one of the class assignments. "We asked everyone to draw their family today," she explained. Most children had drawn parents, grandparents, pets, and colorful houses. Oliver's picture showed 3 people standing beneath a giant oak tree. One was clearly me. One was Oliver himself. The third wore a dark suit, had silver gray eyes, and looked remarkably like the man from yesterday's magazine. Beneath the drawing, written carefully in large kindergarten letters, was a sentence that made my heart skip once again. "Daddy has not found us yet, but he will." After that afternoon, I tried to convince myself that Oliver's drawing was simply another beautiful product of a child's imagination, but the strange moments did not stop. They quietly multiplied. A week later, while we were grocery shopping, a television mounted above the checkout lanes began broadcasting a news segment about the Blackwood Foundation opening another children's learning center. The moment Damien appeared on the screen, Oliver immediately smiled and waved as though greeting someone he expected to wave back. "There he is again," he whispered happily. The cashier laughed kindly. "Your little guy must really admire him." I forced a polite smile, but my stomach tightened. On the drive home, I asked as casually as possible, "Oliver, have you ever seen him anywhere besides magazines or television?" He looked out the window for a moment before answering, "No, but I know he is looking for us. I nearly missed the next traffic light." "Why do you think that?" Oliver shrugged in the simple way only children can. "Because every dream ends before he finds our house." His answer stayed with me for days. At preschool, the children were asked to bring a family photograph for a classroom display. Most proudly carried framed pictures from vacations or birthday parties. Oliver chose one of the few photographs we had together at the community art festival. When his teacher gently asked whether there was another parent she should include, Oliver smiled politely and shook his head. "Not yet," he answered. "He is still coming." His teacher later shared the conversation with me, believing it was simply another example of a hopeful child's imagination. I wished I could believe the same thing. That weekend, my closest friend, Emily, visited our apartment for coffee. She had known me since college and was one of the few people aware that years ago I had briefly met Damien during the charity event. After listening patiently to everything that had happened, she remained unusually quiet. Finally, she asked one question I had carefully avoided asking myself. "Lucas, did you ever tell Oliver anything about Damien?" "Never. Did anyone else?" "No." Emily leaned back and folded her arms. "Then either your son has an extraordinary imagination, or there is something you do not understand yet." Before leaving, she paused beside Oliver's bookshelf, where he had lined up his favorite picture books with perfect care. Tucked between them was a page he had colored earlier that morning. It showed the same tall man standing beneath an enormous oak tree while a little boy reached toward him with both hands. Emily looked at me with quiet concern, but chose not to say another word. That evening, after Oliver had fallen asleep, I searched online for recent interviews with Damien Blackwood, hoping that perhaps Oliver had unconsciously copied details from somewhere I had overlooked. Instead, I found an article describing Damien's latest charitable initiative restoring historic libraries and community gardens across the country. One photograph caught my attention immediately. Damien stood beneath an ancient oak tree planted on the grounds of the original Blackwood estate. My breath caught. It looked astonishingly similar to the tree Oliver had drawn over and over again, despite never having visited the estate or seen those photographs before. I quickly closed my laptop, telling myself the resemblance had to be coincidence. Yet the following morning, while helping Oliver button his jacket before preschool, he looked up at me with the same calm certainty that had unsettled me since the clinic. "Daddy," he asked softly, "when the nice man finally finds us, do you think he will recognize me too?" Oliver's question stayed with me long after I dropped him off at preschool. As I drove toward the community arts center, I realized I was no longer trying to explain away the impossible. Instead, I was searching for a reason that made it less frightening. Children notice details adults overlooked, but this felt different. It was as though Oliver was following an invisible thread that only he could see. That afternoon, the Arts Center hosted a workshop for young students, filling every classroom with laughter, paintbrushes, and colorful paper scattered across long wooden tables. Helping children discover their creativity usually settled my mind, yet every quiet moment pulled my thoughts back toward Damien Blackwood. During lunch, Emily walked into my office carrying 2 cups of coffee. She sat across from me without speaking until I finally sighed. "I looked up more articles about him," I admitted. Emily raised an eyebrow. "And the more I read, the less he sounds like the person the media describes." Public headlines praise Damien as one of the country's most successful billionaire entrepreneurs, but every interview seemed to reveal someone who cared far more about people than profits. His foundation quietly restored schools in struggling communities, funded hospitals in rural towns, and created scholarships without attaching his name to many of them. Former employees described him as a leader who remembered birthdays, visited families during difficult times, and insisted that kindness should never become a publicity campaign. "That is unusual," Emily admitted. "Most powerful people want recognition. He seems to avoid it." Later that evening, curiosity finally overcame hesitation. After Oliver had gone to bed, I watched a documentary produced several years earlier about the Blackwood Foundation. It was supposed to focus on economic development, but what captured my attention was something entirely unexpected. One retired historian explained that the Blackwood family had quietly supported communities for generations, long before the company existed. Their wealth had changed over time, but one tradition remained untouched. Every generation appointed a single guardian responsible for protecting the family's original mission of service before success. The documentary never fully explained what the title meant, dismissing it as an old family custom. Yet several respected historians referred to it with remarkable seriousness. The narrator mentioned that Damien had accepted the role years earlier after the passing of his grandfather. That explained something I had never understood. Damien's decisions had never followed ordinary business logic because his responsibilities had never been ordinary. He was carrying something much older than a corporation. The following Saturday, Oliver and I visited the public library for story time. While he happily joined a group of children listening to a librarian read adventure books, I wandered through the local history section, hoping to distract myself. By chance, I discovered a recently published book about influential philanthropic families. One chapter described the Blackwood estate, including a photograph of an enormous oak tree standing at the center of its gardens. My pulse quickened immediately. It was the same tree Oliver had drawn repeatedly without ever seeing it. Before I could study the page further, an elderly librarian approached with a gentle smile. "Beautiful tree, is it not?" she asked. I nodded. "It looks familiar." She smiled thoughtfully. "People say generations of the Blackwood family gathered beneath it whenever important promises were made. Whether that story is history or legend depends on whom you ask." I carefully closed the book, trying to ignore the growing unease inside me. Just then, Oliver came running across the library carrying his favorite dinosaur book. He stopped beside me, looked down at the open page showing the Blackwood estate, and smiled with quiet certainty. "That is where he waits for us," he whispered, as though he had recognized not only the tree, but the place itself. That night, after Oliver had fallen asleep with one of his dinosaur books resting across his chest, I returned to the photograph of the Blackwood estate that I had borrowed from the library. I studied every detail of the ancient oak tree, trying to understand how my son could possibly recognize a place he had never visited. The more I searched for a logical explanation, the more elusive one became. The following Monday, Emily surprised me by stopping at the art center during lunch carrying a thick history book she had borrowed from a university archive. "I think you should read one chapter," she said quietly. The book focused on the earliest charitable families that had helped shape modern communities long before their names became associated with business success. Hidden within one chapter was a brief section about the Blackwood family. Most readers would probably skip over it without noticing anything unusual, but one paragraph immediately caught my attention. According to old family records, each generation recognized one guardian whose responsibility extended beyond managing wealth. The guardian was expected to preserve compassion, protect vulnerable communities, and quietly guide future generations without seeking public admiration. There was also an unusual tradition mentioned almost as a historical curiosity. Every few generations, a child with an exceptionally rare intuition was believed capable of recognizing the guardian before anyone formally introduced them. Historians disagreed about whether the tradition represented symbolism or something deeper, but every documented account described children identifying the guardian through an unexplainable sense of familiarity rather than ordinary memory. I closed the book slowly, unsure whether I should laugh at the story or feel unsettled by it. The historian himself had written that there was no scientific explanation, only repeated accounts preserved within the family's private archives. That evening, while Oliver colored pictures beside the living room window, I decided to ask one more careful question. "Sweetheart," I said gently, "when you think about the nice man, what do you feel?" Oliver looked up thoughtfully instead of answering immediately. Finally, he smiled in the simple, honest way only a child could. "Safe." I swallowed quietly. "Why safe?" He tapped the green crayon against the paper before replying. "Because he always makes sure nobody is alone." The answer sounded strangely mature coming from a 5-year-old. Before I could ask anything else, he returned to coloring as though the conversation had been completely ordinary. A few days later, our community art center received an unexpected delivery. Large wooden crates filled with professional art supplies arrived with a short note attached. The donation came from the Blackwood Foundation, supporting creative education in underserved neighborhoods. There was no media announcement, no photographers, and no ceremony. The center's director could hardly believe the generosity. Children ran excitedly through the classrooms, admiring fresh canvases, easels, and paint sets that our small budget could never have afforded. As everyone celebrated, I quietly unfolded the accompanying letter. It was signed personally by Damian Blackwood. The message thanked local educators for believing that creativity could change lives and encouraged every child to keep imagining a kinder future. Reading those words brought back memories of the charity event years earlier. They sounded exactly like the man I had briefly known, not the distant billionaire the public imagined. That afternoon, Oliver wandered into the newly stocked art room, stopping beside one unopened crate before anyone else noticed it. He gently rested his small hand against the wooden lid and smiled. "He found us again," he whispered. At that exact moment, my phone vibrated with an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it until I noticed the caller identification displayed beneath the number. Blackwood Foundation. My hand remained frozen above the ringing phone for several seconds before I finally answered. A calm professional voice introduced herself as Sophia Bennett, the Community Outreach Director for the Blackwood Foundation. She explained that the foundation had been reviewing educational programs across the state and had selected our art center as one of several organizations eligible for a long-term partnership supporting children's creative development. Her tone was warm, respectful, and completely free of the formality I had expected. Nothing in the conversation suggested that anyone knew who I was beyond being a local art instructor. Before ending the call, she asked whether I would be willing to visit the Blackwood Foundation headquarters the following week to discuss future programs. I thanked her politely and promised to think about it. After hanging up, I remained seated in the empty classroom while children laughed in the hallway, unsure whether I had just been handed an extraordinary opportunity or opened a door that should have remained closed. That evening I told Emily everything. She listened quietly before asking the question I had secretly been asking myself. If this invitation had come from any other foundation, would you accept it? I answered immediately. Of course. She smiled gently. Then do not let fear make this decision. Let your purpose make it. Her words stayed with me throughout the weekend. I realized I had spent years teaching children to embrace new opportunities while quietly avoiding one myself. On Monday morning, I accepted the invitation. 2 days later, I boarded an early train heading toward the city while Oliver stayed with my parents for the afternoon. The Blackwood Foundation headquarters occupied a beautifully restored historic building overlooking the river. Unlike the towering corporate offices nearby, the building felt welcoming rather than intimidating. Sunlight filled open galleries displaying artwork created by children from community programs across the country. Volunteers greeted visitors by name, and every hallway featured photographs celebrating teachers, nurses, artists, and local volunteers instead of executives. As I waited in the reception area, I noticed another familiar photograph of the ancient oak tree standing proudly in the center of the Blackwood estate. Before I could study it further, Sophia Bennett approached with a welcoming smile. She guided me through several classrooms where students participated in scholarship workshops before leading me into a conference room overlooking the gardens. Mr. Hayes, she said warmly. Mr. Blackwood hoped to attend today's meeting personally, but an unexpected visit to one of our children's hospitals delayed his return. He asked me to apologize. Surprisingly, disappointment settled inside me before I could stop it. I quietly reminded myself that this meeting had never been about Damien. It was about helping children. Sophia presented exciting plans to expand art education into rural communities and invited our center to become one of the pilot locations. Every proposal reflected the same philosophy I had admired years ago. Creativity should never depend on a family's income. Every child deserved the opportunity to imagine a better future. As the meeting concluded, Sophia handed me a small folder containing background materials. One photograph slipped onto the table. It showed Damien visiting a classroom where children proudly displayed colorful paintings. In the corner of the image, partially hidden beneath a large oak tree, stood a bronze plaque engraved with a simple sentence. Great hearts are recognized before great names are understood. The words sent an unexpected chill through me because they echoed everything Oliver had been trying to tell me, without ever fully understanding it himself. As I carefully placed the photograph back inside the folder, the conference room door opened quietly behind me. A familiar voice, calm and unmistakably gentle, spoke my name for the first time in 6 years. Lucas, it has been far too long. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. 6 years disappeared as though they had never existed, leaving only two people standing across from each other in a quiet conference room overlooking the river. Damien looked remarkably similar to the man I remembered, yet there was something calmer in his expression now. Success had never hardened him. If anything, it had made him gentler. He smiled with genuine warmth, not the polished smile often seen in magazine interviews, but the quiet one I remembered from the charity garden years ago. I hoped our paths would cross again someday, he said sincerely. I managed a small smile. I did not expect it to happen like this. He glanced toward the folder resting in my hands. Sophia tells me wonderful things about your art center. The children are fortunate to have someone who believes in them the way you do. His words surprised me. You know about my work? Damien nodded naturally. When we evaluate community programs, I always ask to learn about the people behind them. Buildings and budgets matter, but the people change lives. The conversation flowed more easily than I expected. We spoke about creative education, expanding opportunities for rural schools, and the confidence children discovered when someone believed in their imagination. Not once did Damien mention his wealth or position. Every question he asked centered on the students, their families, and what they still needed. Eventually, he walked with me through one of the foundation's galleries displaying artwork created by children from scholarship programs. He paused before a colorful painting of a family standing beneath a large oak tree. Children often draw what makes them feel safe, he said thoughtfully. Sometimes they understand belonging long before adults do. His observation made my heart skip, though I kept my expression calm. Before I could respond, Sophia quietly approached and handed Damien a folder requiring his signature. As she walked away, Damien looked back at me with an apologetic smile. "May I ask you something?" I nodded. "Do you have a family?" The question was gentle, free from curiosity or expectation. I hesitated only briefly before answering honestly. "Yes, I have a son." Something subtle changed in Damien's eyes. It was not shock, disappointment, or regret. It was quiet happiness. "How old is he?" "5. Damien smiled to himself for a moment. Children at that age ask the most remarkable questions. I laughed softly. That is certainly true. We continued walking until we reached a glass wall overlooking the foundation gardens. In the distance stood another magnificent oak tree surrounded by children participating in an outdoor art class. Damien watched them with unmistakable affection. "Everything this foundation builds," he said quietly, "begins with one simple belief. Every child deserves to grow up knowing that someone chose to show up for them." Those words lingered between us long after he finished speaking. They sounded less like a mission statement and more like a deeply personal promise. As our meeting came to an end, Damien handed me his business card, though it felt more like an invitation than a formality. "If your students ever need anything," he said warmly, "please contact me directly. I cannot solve every problem, but I will always try." There was no pressure, no expectation, and no attempt to reopen the past. Just quiet sincerity. As I prepared to leave, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a message from my mother. Attached was a photograph she had just taken at the park while watching Oliver. My son stood beneath an enormous oak tree, smiling toward the empty path ahead of him. Beneath the picture, she had written one simple sentence. "Oliver keeps saying he knows someone important is finally coming home." The photograph my mother sent stayed on my phone screen for the entire drive home. Oliver stood beneath the old oak tree with the peaceful confidence of someone waiting for a familiar friend rather than a stranger. When I arrived at my parents' house, he ran toward me with his usual excitement, proudly holding a drawing he had made that afternoon. Once again, 3 people stood beneath a wide tree with golden leaves. This time, however, the figures were holding hands. "Did you have a good day?" I asked as we walked to the car together. Oliver nodded happily. "Grandma let me feed the ducks, and I told the nice tree that I think he is getting closer." I smiled gently. "Who is getting closer?" He looked at me as though the answer were obvious. "The man who smiles like home." His words settled quietly in my heart. Over the next several days, I found myself thinking less about impossible explanations and more about the person I had spoken with inside the foundation. Damien had not asked uncomfortable questions. He had not tried to search through my past or place himself back into my life. Instead, he had focused entirely on helping children, exactly as he had years before. The consistency of his character somehow made everything else feel even more extraordinary. A week later, the Blackwood Foundation invited our art center to participate in a family creativity festival held at one of its public gardens. Schools, community centers, and nonprofit organizations from across the state would spend the weekend hosting free activities for children. Mrs. Evelyn Carter insisted our students attend, and before long, I found myself helping set up painting stations beneath rows of white tents, while Oliver excitedly carried boxes of crayons much too large for his small arms. The festival felt warm and welcoming rather than formal. Volunteers laughed together, musicians performed gentle acoustic songs, and children covered long murals with colorful handprints representing hope, kindness, and imagination. Near the center of the gardens stood the same magnificent oak tree I had seen in photographs so many times before. It seemed even larger in person, its wide branches stretching across the afternoon sky, like a shelter built for everyone who gathered beneath it. Oliver became unusually quiet the moment he saw it. Without saying a word, he gently took my hand and led me toward the tree. Before I could ask why, another group of children ran past us, laughing as they chased soap bubbles floating through the air. Across the lawn, Damien had just arrived after visiting another community event. There were no television cameras surrounding him, only volunteers greeting him warmly as he stopped to speak with families one by one. He knelt to compliment children's artwork, thanked teachers personally, and listened far more than he talked. Oliver watched him for several silent seconds before looking up at me. "Can we go say hello?" he asked softly. My heart raced, but I looked into my son's hopeful eyes and realized something important. Every decision until now had been shaped by my fears rather than his curiosity. I took a slow breath and smiled. "If that is what you want, we can." Oliver squeezed my hand and nodded with complete certainty. Together we walked across the lawn. Damien looked up just as we approached, and his warm smile immediately returned. Before I could introduce anyone or explain a single thing, Oliver stepped forward on his own, looked directly into Damien's eyes, and asked with the gentle honesty only a child possesses, "Would it be all right if we got to know each other? I think I have been waiting for you for a very long time." For one quiet moment, the entire festival seemed to fade into the background. The laughter of children, the music drifting through the gardens, and the conversations between volunteers became little more than a gentle whisper carried by the afternoon breeze. Damien looked down at Oliver with unmistakable warmth, then slowly knelt until they were at eye level. There was no surprise in his expression, only kindness and careful respect. "I would like that very much," he answered softly, "but only if it is something you truly want." Oliver smiled with complete certainty and nodded. "I do." Damien extended his hand, not expecting anything, simply offering the choice. Oliver happily placed his small hand into Damien's, and the simple gesture somehow felt more meaningful than any dramatic reunion could ever have been. No promises were forced. No expectations were placed upon anyone. It was only the beginning of a conversation built on trust. Over the following months, Damien became a steady presence in our lives without ever trying to change them overnight. Sometimes he joined us for Saturday art workshops at the community center. Other weekends he invited us to public gardens, science museums, or children's book festivals where Oliver enthusiastically asked endless questions about everything he saw. Damien answered every one with remarkable patience, encouraging curiosity instead of rushing toward easy answers. He never attempted to replace the years he had missed. Instead, he chose to earn each new memory one ordinary day at a time. Watching the two of them together taught me something I had never fully understood before. A true father was not defined by a title, wealth, or even biology alone. A true father showed up consistently, listened carefully, and made a child feel safe enough to become exactly who they were meant to be. One evening, as autumn leaves covered the sidewalks outside our apartment, Oliver quietly looked up from his drawing and asked, "Can Damien come to my school art show next week?" Before I could answer, Damien smiled gently. "Only if your daddy says yes." Oliver immediately turned toward me. I laughed through unexpectedly emotional eyes before nodding. "I think that sounds like a wonderful idea." The art show became one of many ordinary milestones we celebrated together. School concerts, birthday parties, community projects, and volunteer events slowly filled our calendar until our lives no longer felt like separate stories that had finally crossed paths. They had become one shared journey built through countless small choices made with honesty and care. Several years later, the Blackwood Foundation partnered with our community art center to establish the Blackwood Hayes Creative Academy, providing free arts education, scholarships, and family support programs for children from every background. Damien insisted that every child should have the same opportunity to dream regardless of circumstance, while I focused on helping young artists discover confidence through creativity. Oliver proudly volunteered beside us, welcoming new students with the same bright smile that had changed all of our lives years earlier. Near the entrance of the academy stood a bronze sculpture beneath a magnificent oak tree. It portrayed an adult reaching toward a child while another adult stood beside them, not leading the way, but walking together. Engraved beneath the sculpture were the words we chose together after many thoughtful conversations. Family begins with love, grows through trust, and becomes forever through the choice to be there every single day. Whenever visitors asked why those words mattered so much, I always smiled because the answer was wonderfully simple. The greatest miracle in our story was never that a little boy recognized someone in a photograph. The greatest miracle was that kindness, patience, and love gave three ordinary hearts the courage to recognize one another long before the rest of the world ever understood what family truly meant.